What if the moment women's basketball finally got its biggest star ever, the sport itself tried to swallow her whole? Not with silence, not with indifference, with something far more calculated than that. Here's the thing nobody wants to say out loud. The people who should be throwing a parade right now are the ones sharpening their knives instead. And somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean, European organization just slid a contract across a table that could reroute the entire future of women's basketball in America forever. This is not a story about basketball anymore. This is a story about what happens when one woman becomes too big for the room she was handed. Let's go back to where all of this really starts. Because you cannot understand the fury without understanding what Caitlin Clark walked into from the very first second she arrived. She didn't just come into the WNBA as a hyped rookie. She came in as a phenomenon, as a force, as someone who had already done something that veteran players, women who had given a decade of their lives to this league, had never once managed to pull off. She made people care. Not just basketball fans. Not just women's sports fans. Regular, everyday Americans who couldn't have named a single WNBA team a year prior were suddenly rearranging their schedules to catch her games. Bars were turning on WNBA matchups. Sports radio was actually debating her performances. Television ratings were doing things nobody had seen in the history of the league. And all of that happened before she played a single professional minute. That's the part that matters. That's the part that created the tension that eventually exploded into what we're watching unfold right now. Because when you arrive carrying that much attention, that much commercial energy, that much cultural momentum, you don't just enter a league. You shake its entire foundation. Some people in that building were ready to welcome the earthquake. Most of them were not. The WNBA has been grinding for decades. Genuinely gifted athletes playing elite basketball in front of crowds that, for most of the league's history, range from modest to painfully sparse. These women sacrifice comfortable salaries, mainstream recognition, and in many cases personal stability to keep this league alive, season after season, year after year, believing that eventually the culture would catch up to the quality of the product on the floor. And then Caitlin Clark walked through the door, and the culture caught up overnight. That is not an exaggeration. That is simply what the data shows, what the ticket sales show, what the merchandise numbers show, and what every television executive who suddenly started returning the WNBA's phone calls will tell you without hesitation. She is, by every measurable metric available, the single most commercially impactful player this league has ever seen. Not over time, not gradually, immediately. Now here's where it gets complicated. And this is the part that the people screaming on social media don't want to sit with honestly for even 30 seconds. Caitlin Clark did not take anything from the women who came before her. She didn't shrink their legacy. She didn't erase their contributions. What she did was attract a floodlight so powerful that it illuminated the entire arena, the whole sport, the whole history, the whole struggle. A rising tide, by every economic logic available, was supposed to lift every boat in that harbor. Instead, what happened was the opposite of gratitude. What happened was resentment dressed up as principle. Veterans started talking, not in locker rooms, not in private, publicly, on platforms with millions of followers, in tones that range from dismissive to outright hostile. The message, stripped of the careful wording, was consistent. She hasn't earned this. She doesn't deserve the attention. Let her pay her dues like the rest of us did. But here's the question nobody asking that has been willing to answer. Pay dues to whom exactly? To a structure that kept their own salaries criminally low for 30 years? To a system that needed a Caitlin Clark moment to finally start fixing itself? The frustration was real. The bitterness was real. But the target was completely wrong. And now, with a European contract sitting on the table and the clock quietly ticking, the WNBA is about to find out exactly how wrong it got this whole situation. Let's talk about the number. Because when the details of this European contract offer started leaking out, it didn't just make headlines. It detonated. It spread across every sports platform, every basketball forum, every talk show green room simultaneously, like someone had dropped a match into a room full of gasoline. And the reason it hit that hard wasn't just the figure itself. It was what the figure meant. For context, and this context is absolutely essential, Caitlin Clark's rookie salary in the WNBA was approximately $76,000 for the entire season. That is not a typo. That is not a misprint. $76,000 for the most watched, most talked about, most commercially valuable player the league had seen in a generation, while her jersey was selling out nationally, while her games were drawing television numbers that made network executives genuinely emotional, while arenas that had been half empty for years were suddenly turning people away at the door. $76,000. Now take that number, hold it in your mind, and place it next to what European teams were reportedly prepared to offer her. We're talking about a figure that doesn't just dwarf her WNBA salary. It obliterates it so completely that the comparison almost becomes comedic. Reports began circulating about an offer constructed to make her the highest-paid women's basketball player on the entire planet. Not in Europe, on Earth. That's the moment the conversation stopped being about basketball and started being about something much larger. The overseas market for American basketball talent is not new. WNBA players have been supplementing their domestic salaries with European contracts for years, decades. Actually, it has been a quiet, accepted, slightly uncomfortable reality of the sport. The league pays what the league pays. The offseason exists. Players travel, they compete, they cash checks that allow them to actually build financial stability, and then they come back for the next WNBA season. It's been a functional, if imperfect, system. But what's being discussed with Caitlin Clark isn't a supplemental off-season contract. What's being floated is a full, primary, life-defining commitment to a European organization that wants to make her the centerpiece of their entire brand. Not a piece, the centerpiece, the face, the reason people buy tickets, tune in and care. That is a fundamentally different proposition. And everyone inside the WNBA ecosystem felt the temperature shift the moment those details started circulating. Because for the first time in recent memory, the league isn't just at risk of losing a player to overseas competition. It's at risk of losing the player, the one whose presence has single-handedly moved the needle on television deals, sponsorship conversations, and expansion discussions that have been stalling for years. Lose Caitlin Clark to Europe, and you don't just lose a roster spot. You potentially lose the momentum of an entire era. Now here's where the reaction from inside the league becomes truly revealing, because it tells you everything about the fractures that were already there long before this contract offer surfaced. The response from WNBA veterans was not panic. It was not a collective rallying cry to fix the conditions that made Europe's offer so attractive in the first place. It was not a unified statement demanding the league address its broken salary structure immediately. It was anger directed at her, players who had spent years advocating, rightfully, for better pay and better treatment looked at a situation where the market was screaming the value of women's basketball from the rooftops, and instead of seeing an opportunity, they saw a threat. Instead of recognizing that Clark's leverage was everyone's leverage, they treated her visibility as a personal offense. Some had spilled out subtly, loaded comments in interviews, vague social media posts with timestamps that weren't remotely vague in their intent. The language of grievance wrapped loosely around the language of professionalism. Some of it wasn't subtle at all, and the fans noticed. They always do. What makes this moment genuinely historic isn't just the money, it's the choice it forces into the open. Because for the first time, a player with Caitlin Clark's cultural footprint has real, credible, financially transformative options outside the United States. Europe isn't asking her to slum it. Europe isn't offering her a consolation prize. Europe is offering her the kind of respect and compensation that the WNBA, structurally, simply cannot match right now. That gap between what she generates and what she receives has always existed in women's sports. What's different now is that somebody found a way to close it, and the people who should have been celebrating that breakthrough are the ones who can't bring themselves to look at it clearly. The question now isn't whether the offer is real. The question is whether the WNBA understands just how close it is to losing the argument entirely. There's a moment in every great sports story where the subtext stops being subtext, where the tension that's been simmering just beneath the surface, the whispers, the loaded glances, the carefully worded interviews, finally breaks through into something physical, something visible, something that gets caught on camera and replayed 1,000 times because people cannot quite believe what they're seeing. For Caitlin Clark's story, there have been several of those moments, and every single one of them has been more revealing than the last. Let's be precise about something from the very beginning, because this conversation gets muddied constantly by people who want to argue in bad faith. Professional basketball is a physical sport, always has been. Contact happens. Hard fouls happen. Players get knocked down, get back up, and keep playing. That is not the issue. Nobody credible is arguing that Caitlin Clark should be playing a bubble, untouched and unchallenged. The issue is pattern. The issue is intent. The issue is what happens after the whistle blows, or more accurately, what doesn't happen. Because when you watch the footage, really watch it, not in isolation but sequentially, one incident after another, something becomes impossible to dismiss. The fouls targeting Clark carry a specific energy that goes beyond competitive aggression. There's a message embedded in the physicality, a communication happening on the court that the players involved understand completely. Even if the broadcast team occasionally struggles to name it directly, she is being sent a message, repeatedly, systematically. And the officials, the league, and the front office have responded to that message with a silence so consistent it has essentially become its own kind of answer. The eye poke incident crystallized everything. On the court, in real time, it looked like the kind of play that happens in contested basketball. A hand in the wrong place. A collision neither player fully controlled. Painful, jarring. The kind of thing that stops play and draws a collective wince from everyone in the arena. But then came what happened next. And what happened next is where the story actually lives. Instead of the standard professional acknowledgement, a nod, a check-in, the basic human decency that athletes extend to each other even in the most fiercely competitive environments, the player involved chose a different path entirely. Social media became the platform. Mockery became the tone. The injury became content. She mimicked Clark publicly. She turned the moment into a performance. And she did it with the casual confidence of someone who had absolutely no expectation of consequences whatsoever. That confidence, it turned out, was completely justified because the consequences never came. Think about what that silence communicates to everyone watching, not just to Clark herself, but to every young woman who grew up watching her at Iowa and followed her into the professional game as a fan, not just the casual viewers who tuned in because of her and are now trying to make sense of what they're seeing. To everyone, it communicates that this behavior exists within an acceptable range, that the league has assessed the situation and determined that protecting its most marketable asset is less important than avoiding an uncomfortable internal conversation, that the unwritten social dynamics operating inside that locker room ecosystem carry more institutional weight than the public image of the league itself. That is an extraordinary organizational choice. And it is one that the WNBA will be answering questions about long after this particular news cycle fades. Here's what makes the physical targeting so strategically self-defeating. And this is the part that should keep league executives awake at night. Every time Clark takes a hard, uncalled foul on a nationally televised broadcast, the cameras don't just capture the foul. They capture the reaction, the crowd, the commentators trying to navigate the moment carefully, the replays from 4 different angles, the slow motion breakdown that ends up clipped and shared millions of times across every platform by morning. The physicality isn't silencing the conversation about her treatment. It's amplifying it. Every elbow, every shove, every moment of unchecked aggression becomes another chapter in a narrative that is making the WNBA look not tough, but petty, not competitive, but threatened. And meanwhile, the European organization watching all of this from across the ocean is taking very careful notes. They see a player absorbing punishment with composure. They see a market responding to her presence with genuine, sustained passion. They see a league fumbling what should have been the simplest possible assignment. Protect your golden asset. Grow the audience she brought you. Build something lasting on top of the foundation she laid. Instead, what they see is an institution seemingly determined to humble a player the market has already decided is priceless. The veterans who are loudest about Clark needing to toughen up, needing to handle the physicality, needing to stop drawing attention to the fouls. They are not wrong that professional basketball demands toughness. That part is accurate. What they are wrong about, catastrophically wrong about, is their assumption that toughness means staying silent and staying put. Toughness can also look like picking up the phone, listening to the Europeans, and making a decision that prioritizes your own future over loyalty to a league that has made its priorities abundantly clear. She has absorbed the message the WNBA has been sending her since her very first game. The question now is whether she's ready to send one back. There's a version of this story where the veterans are the heroes, where the women who spent years building this league, playing through empty arenas, negotiating humiliating contracts, representing their sport in front of crowds that barely filled a high school gymnasium, finally get the recognition they deserved all along, where the arrival of mainstream attention becomes a collective victory, where everyone who sacrificed for decades gets to stand in the light that a new generation helped switch on. That version of the story was available. It was right there for the taking. And somewhere along the way, a significant number of people decided not to take it. To understand why, you have to understand what it actually felt like to be a WNBA veteran in the years before Caitlin Clark arrived. Not the polished press conference version of that experience. The real version. You are an elite athlete, genuinely elite. You have skills that took 15 years to develop, a basketball IQ that most people watching could never fully appreciate, and a competitive fire that gets you out of bed at 5 in the morning regardless of what the schedule says. You have given everything to this sport. Everything. And the average American not only cannot name you, they cannot name your team. They cannot name your conference. They scroll past highlights of your most extraordinary performances without pausing, because the algorithm never learned to show them to the people who might actually care. That is not bitterness talking. That is a documented, measurable, financially verifiable reality of what it meant to be a professional women's basketball player in America for most of the league's existence. The talent was always there. The work ethic was always there. The quality of the product on the floor was always there. The audience simply wasn't. Not at the scale the sport deserved. So when Caitlin Clark arrived and the audience followed, overnight, dramatically, in numbers that made network executives suddenly remember they owned the broadcasting rights to a product they've been quietly undervaluing for years. The emotional response from veterans was complicated. Genuinely, humanly complicated. Because the question that nobody wanted to ask out loud, but that everyone was quietly asking themselves, is a brutal one. Why her? Why now? Why not us? That question deserves a real answer, not a dismissive one, not a sanitized one that pretends the frustration isn't legitimate. A real one. The honest answer has multiple layers, and none of them are particularly comfortable for anyone involved in this conversation. The first layer is visibility architecture. Caitlin Clark arrived in a media environment that simply did not exist 10 years ago. Social media had matured into a full distribution system. Short-form video had trained an entire generation to consume sports highlights the way previous generations consumed SportsCenter. The infrastructure for a player to build a following outside of traditional broadcast was finally fully developed, and she used it with precision that felt almost instinctive. The second layer is the college pipeline. Her 4 years at Iowa didn't just build a fan base. They built a committed, emotionally invested community that followed her into the professional game with the kind of loyalty that sports franchises spend decades trying to manufacture artificially. She didn't arrive as a prospect. She arrived as an established cultural figure with a ready-made audience already waiting for her at the next level. The third layer is the one that's hardest to talk about honestly in this current climate, so most people simply don't. But it exists, and pretending otherwise serves nobody. There are structural realities about who gets mainstream American sports media coverage, who gets the crossover celebrity treatment, who gets the magazine covers and the primetime feature segments. And those realities did not begin with Caitlin Clark and will not end with her. Veterans who feel that the playing field for attention was never level are not imagining that. They are correct. But here is where the logic breaks down completely. Here is where the grievance, legitimate at its root, gets aimed in entirely the wrong direction. Caitlin Clark did not build those structural inequities. She did not design the media landscape. She did not write the algorithms. She did not decide which stories American sports culture chose to tell and which ones it quietly buried. She simply showed up, played extraordinary basketball, and became the vessel through which a long overdue wave of attention finally crashed into the shore. The veterans who are spending their energy directing hostility toward her are making a strategic error So fundamental, it's almost difficult to watch. Because every minute spent undermining Clark publicly is a minute not spent demanding the structural changes that the current moment, the moment her presence created, finally makes possible to demand. The league is at the negotiating table in ways it hasn't been in years. Sponsors are calling. Broadcasters are paying attention. The cultural conversation has shifted in ways that directly strengthen the hand of every player currently in the WNBA, not just a rookie from Iowa. That leverage doesn't belong to Caitlin Clark alone. It belongs to collective. But only if the collective is smart enough to use it together instead of fracturing along fault lines of resentment. An ego at the exact moment unity would be worth the most. There's a mirror sitting in the middle of all of this. A clear, unambiguous mirror that reflects exactly what is happening and exactly why. The players who are most vocal in their frustration are not upset that Caitlin Clark is getting paid. They're upset that they aren't getting paid more. And they are absolutely right to want more. Their anger about compensation is completely valid. But valid anger aimed at the wrong target doesn't fix anything. It just makes noise. And right now, the noise is drowning out the conversation that could actually change the financial reality for every woman who puts on a WNBA jersey, today, tomorrow, and 20 years from now. The irony is almost unbearable. The very moment the league has its best argument for transformative investment sitting right there in the form of one generationally compelling player, they are undermining her publicly, on camera, in ways that make the entire enterprise look small and self-defeating. And Europe keeps watching, keeps calculating, keeps making the contract more attractive with every new headline. The veterans wanted the world to finally pay attention to women's basketball. It is paying attention now. This is not what they meant, but it is what they got. And what happens next depends entirely on whether anyone inside that league is willing to look honestly into that mirror and reckon with what's actually staring back at them. There is a specific kind of silence that is louder than anything words could produce. Not the silence of ignorance. Not the silence of uncertainty. The silence of a calculated institutional decision to look the other way and hope the problem either resolves itself or gets buried under the next news cycle before anyone starts asking the questions that don't have comfortable answers. That is a silence the WNBA has been performing since this entire situation escalated. And at this point, that silence has communicated more about the league's priorities than any press release or commissioner statement ever could. Let's establish what the league actually knew, and when it knew it. The tension surrounding Caitlin Clark was not subtle. It was not hidden. It was not the kind of behind-the-scenes drama that front offices can credibly claim they weren't aware of. It played out on nationally televised broadcasts, on social media platforms with millions of followers, in post-game press conferences where the questions were being asked directly and the answers were carefully constructed to say as little as possible while technically saying something. The fouls were visible. The mockery was public. The social media hostility was documented, time-stamped, and shared by millions of people who were watching the situation with increasing discomfort. And the league's response, measured, delayed, cautious to the point of paralysis, sent a signal that every player on every roster received and processed immediately. The signal was this: we are more afraid of the internal politics of this locker room ecosystem than we are committed to protecting our most valuable public asset. That is the remarkable institutional choice. And it carries consequences that extend far beyond one player's career decision. Consider what the league's posture looks like from the outside, from the perspective of a corporate sponsor trying to decide whether to deepen their investment in women's basketball, from the perspective of a television network evaluating whether last season's ratings spike was a sustainable trend or a one-time anomaly, from the perspective of a city council weighing whether to support a new arena deal for their local franchise. All of those conversations require confidence. They require the belief that the league is being managed with strategic intelligence, that its leadership understands what it has and is protecting accordingly, that the growth of the past year is being stewarded by people who grasp both its fragility and its potential. The silence communicates the opposite of confidence. It communicates an organization so tangled in its own internal dynamics that it cannot perform the most basic function of institutional leadership, which is to stand up clearly and publicly for the conditions that make continued growth possible. Meanwhile, the European offer sits on the table. And every day the league fails to respond meaningfully to the environment it has allowed to develop is another day that often becomes more reasonable, more attractive, more difficult to turn down. Here's what makes the league's position particularly precarious right now. And this is the part that the internal critics consistently underestimate. Caitlin Clark leaving for Europe would not just be a roster loss. It would be a narrative catastrophe of the first order. Because the story that would follow her departure, the story that every sports journalist, every podcast host, every social media commentator would tell immediately and repeatedly, is not the story of a player who chose more money. It is the story of a league that had the defining player of its generation in its hands and fumbled her, that failed to create the conditions where she felt valued, protected, and committed to staying, that allowed a poisonous internal culture to fester publicly until the most important player in the sport decided that an ocean's worth of distance was preferable to another season of what she'd already experienced. That story does not fade. That story becomes a defining narrative of this era of women's basketball in America. It gets referenced in every future conversation about why the WNBA struggled to capitalize on its greatest commercial opportunity. It becomes a cautionary tale that gets taught in sports management programs for the next 20 years. The league has to understand that. It has to. The question is whether understanding it is enough to actually change the behavior that created the problem. There's another dimension to the league's silence that doesn't get discussed nearly enough, and it involves the players who are not making noise. Because not every WNBA veteran has been hostile. Not every established player has taken shots on social media or made loaded comments in interviews. There's a quiet majority in this league, women who understand exactly what Clark's presence means for the collective future, who recognize the opportunities sitting in front of them, who would prefer a different internal dynamic but feel the social pressure of locker room culture too acutely to say so publicly. Those players exist in significant numbers. And the league's failure to create space for that perspective, to amplify the voices of the veterans who get it, who see the bigger picture, who want to build something lasting on top of the foundation Clark helped lay, is itself a form of institutional negligence. Leadership isn't just about managing crises after they explode. It's about creating conditions where the right voices rise naturally, where constructive perspectives get oxygen, where the culture and organization reflects its stated values rather than its unexamined internal politics. The WNBA had the tools to do that work. It had the moment. It had the momentum. It chose silence instead. And now the clock is running. Not metaphorically, literally. Contract decisions have timelines. European leagues have seasons that star on their own schedules regardless of what's happening in American sports media. The window for the WNBA to demonstrate, through actions, not statements, that it values what it has is not permanently open. Every week of institutional paralysis is a week the other side of this negotiation uses productively. Every press conference where the commissioner offers careful non-answers is another press conference clip that makes its way to the desks of the people putting together the European package. The silence was always a choice. It remains a choice. And the cost of that choice is compounding daily in ways that the ledger will eventually make impossible to ignore. What the league does in the next few weeks, whether it finally finds its voice, whether it acts with the urgency the moment demands, whether it demonstrates any understanding of the magnitude of what it stands to lose, will define its trajectory for the next decade. Not because one player is bigger than the sport. She isn't. But because how an institution treats its most visible moment of opportunity tells you everything about what that institution actually believes about its own future. Right now, the WNBA's silence is speaking, clearly, consistently, and at considerable volume. The only question left is whether anyone in a position of authority is finally ready to answer back. There's another dimension to the league's silence that doesn't get discussed nearly enough, and it involves the players who are not making noise. Because not every WNBA veteran has been hostile. Not every established player has taken shots on social media or made loaded comments in interviews. There's a quiet majority in this league, women who understand exactly what Clark's presence means for the collective future, who recognize the opportunities sitting in front of them, who would prefer a different internal dynamic but feel the social pressure of locker room culture too acutely to say so publicly. Those players exist in significant numbers. And the league's failure to create space for that perspective, to amplify the voices of the veterans who get it, who see the bigger picture, who want to build something lasting on top of the foundation Clark helped lay, is itself a form of institutional negligence. Leadership isn't just about managing crises after they explode. It's about creating conditions where the right voices rise naturally, where constructive perspectives get oxygen, where the culture and organization reflects its stated values rather than its unexamined internal politics. The WNBA had the tools to do that work. It had the moment. It had the momentum. It chose silence instead. And now the clock is running. Not metaphorically, literally. Contract decisions have timelines. European leagues have seasons that star on their own schedules regardless of what's happening in American sports media. The window for the WNBA to demonstrate, through actions, not statements, that it values what it has is not permanently open. Every week of institutional paralysis is a week the other side of this negotiation uses productively. Every press conference where the commissioner offers careful non-answers is another press conference clip that makes its way to the desks of the people putting together the European package. The silence was always a choice. It remains a choice. And the cost of that choice is compounding daily in ways that the ledger will eventually make impossible to ignore. What the league does in the next few weeks, whether it finally finds its voice, whether it acts with the urgency the moment demands, whether it demonstrates any understanding of the magnitude of what it stands to lose, will define its trajectory for the next decade. Not because one player is bigger than the sport. She isn't. But because how an institution treats its most visible moment of opportunity tells you everything about what that institution actually believes about its own future. Right now, the WNBA's silence is speaking, clearly, consistently, and at considerable volume. The only question left is whether anyone in a position of authority is finally ready to answer back. The connection she has with American fans, the young girls who watched her at Iowa and see themselves in her game, the casual sports viewers who found their entry point into women's basketball through her personality and her play, the communities that formed around following her journey from college phenomenon to professional player. That connection is geographically rooted in a way that transcends basketball. She is not just a player